My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm 38 years old. And on the night my mother laughed at me across a white tablecloth in front of people she was desperate to impress, I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I set my napkin down, folded it the way they teach you in culinary school, corner to corner, once clean, and I waited. Because I already knew something she didn't. I'd known it since I walked through the front door of that restaurant and recognized the floor plan I'd spent 2 years feeding private dinners in. She laughed at the wrong woman in the wrong room. By the end of the evening, the man who owned the place would come out of his kitchen, cross the dining room, and say my name the way you say the name of someone you trust. And my mother, who had spent the better part of a decade telling anyone who'd listen that I'd never quite landed on my feet, would have to sit at her own carefully arranged table and watch the version of me she'd been erasing walk right back into the room. I didn't plan it that way, but I'd learned something in the years between my divorce and that dinner table. The truth doesn't need a dramatic entrance. It just needs a patient one. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories. I'm glad you're here. Drop a comment and subscribe before we go any further, because this one takes its time, and it earns it. Let me back up, because the restaurant wasn't the beginning. The beginning was a woman with a gift for editing. My mother, Diane Vasquez, has always been the kind of person who sees the world as a series of presentations. Every gathering is a performance. Every relationship is an opportunity to be well regarded. She is not a cruel woman in the way people mean when they use that word. She doesn't wish harm on people she loves. What she does, and has always done, with a consistency I have come to almost admire, is decide what version of you best serves the story she is currently telling, and then hold that version in place long after the actual you has moved on. For most of my adult life, the version of me she held in place was the one that fell apart. I got married young, 24, to a man named David, who was charming in exactly the way that doesn't survive contact with ordinary life. By 29, we were done. I had a 2-year-old named Marco, a lease I couldn't quite cover alone, and a culinary school certificate I'd deferred 3 years into a marriage that kept telling me we'd get to my dreams eventually. The divorce wasn't dramatic. It was just the slow recognition that eventually was never coming. What I did after that is the part of the story my mother never quite picked up. She knew the falling part because I called her when I was scared, and she came, and she helped, and I am genuinely grateful for that. She drove 4 hours with groceries the week David left. She watched Marco so I could sleep. She was there in the ways that mattered when the floor dropped out. But somewhere in the helping, she made a decision about me. She decided that the woman who called her crying from an empty kitchen was the permanent version. That the falling was the destination and not just the weather. I didn't know she was still holding that version 3 years later when I'd already built something new. I found out the way you find out most things about yourself through other people. By accident, too late, and in front of a crowd. I run a catering company. That's the short version. The longer version is that I built it out of nothing on a folding table in a one-bedroom apartment while Marco napped, starting with a single corporate lunch account I won by showing up to a Chamber of Commerce meeting with a tray of food samples and refusing to leave until someone tried one. That was 6 years ago. Today, Vasquez Private Events has 4 full-time employees, a commercial kitchen I lease in the Riverside district, and enough regular accounts to have quietly, without fanfare, turned a corner I once wasn't sure existed. I didn't announce it. I'm not built that way. I just kept cooking and kept billing and kept showing up, and the business became real the way things become real when you stop waiting for permission to believe in them. My biggest and longest running account is Ferrara's. Ferrara's is the kind of restaurant that people in this city go to for important dinners. Not the most expensive. It's not trying to be that. It's trying to be good, and it is. It has a private dining room in the back that seats 30 and a terrace that hosts outdoor events in the warm months. For the past 2 years, whenever Ferrara's books a private event, a rehearsal dinner, a corporate reception, an anniversary party for a family that wants more than a set menu, they call my kitchen. Nico Ferrara, who owns the place, is a compact, precise man in his mid-50s who speaks in the shorthand of someone who has been cooking since before he had a choice in the matter. He calls me Vasquez. He says it the way coaches say surnames, with something underneath it that functions as respect. He has introduced me to clients as the best private events caterer in the county, and because Nico is not a man who flatters, I hold that sentence carefully. None of my family knew any of this, not because I hid it. I don't hide things. I just stopped narrating my life to people who weren't listening. My mother and I spoke every few weeks, the kind of phone calls that are more maintenance than connection, where you report the surface conditions and leave the weather beneath them undescribed. She knew I had a catering business. She knew it was doing okay. What okay meant to her was probably not what okay meant to the woman who could cover her own mortgage in a single good quarter. I didn't correct the gap. I suppose I thought it would close on its own, gradually, the way all gaps do when the truth keeps accumulating. I didn't realize she'd been actively maintaining it, keeping the fallen version current, circulating it, offering it to new people as introduction. I found out when my sister called, 8 days before the dinner. Before I go any further, I want to tell you something about the kitchen I built the business from, because the kitchen is the part my mother never visited, and the kitchen is where the whole story actually lives. For the first 2 years after David left, I catered small, office lunches, birthday parties, a semi-regular brunch account at a small hotel near the convention center that paid just enough to keep me from touching the emergency savings I was holding on to the way you hold on to the last grip on a ledge. I did all of it out of a home kitchen with a 6-burner range and a reach-in refrigerator I'd bought secondhand from a restaurant that was closing. Marco was 2 the first year, then 3. He would sit in his high chair at the far end of the kitchen while I prepped, and I would talk to him while I worked because silence made the math too loud. I'd narrate the cooking, what I was doing, why, what it would taste like, and he'd watch with the focused interest of a small person for whom the world is still almost entirely inexplicable, and therefore entirely interesting. I think those years shaped him as much as anything I've done since. He grew up understanding that a kitchen is a place where something gets made, that making something is the solution to most problems, that when things fall apart, you go back to the basics: heat, time, salt, patience. He also grew up understanding that his mother woke up early and stayed up late and still found time to read to him, and somewhere in that understanding he formed the opinion that I was capable, which has been one of the most useful things anyone has ever believed about me. When Vasquez Private Events got its first real contract, a full-season account with a corporate park in the Riverside district that needed catered lunches 3 days a week, I leased the commercial kitchen the next month. I told Marco we were going to see the new kitchen, and he put on his shoes carefully, the way he does when something is being treated as an occasion, and he walked through that commercial space beside me, looking up at the stainless steel and the hood vents and the long prep tables. "This is big," he said. "It is," I said, "for a lot of food." "For a lot of food," he nodded seriously. "That's good," he said, "because you make really good food." I have paid for his opinion since then in school lunches that are the object of considerable cafeteria envy, and I consider it a fair exchange. My sister Cora is 29. She is lovely in the way that younger siblings sometimes are when they've been protected from every sharp edge their whole lives by the body of an older one absorbing the impact. She has my mother's ease in a room and none of her mother's habit of editing people. When Cora is thoughtful, it's genuine. The problem is that thoughtfulness and backbone are not the same thing, and Cora has always had more of the first than the second. She called on a Tuesday evening while I was doing inventory. Marco was at the kitchen table doing homework, erasing the same math problem for the third time, tongue out in concentration the way he's done since he was 3. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to hear it as me trying to help, not me throwing Mom under the bus." I set down my clipboard. When someone opens with that sentence, what follows is always squarely under the bus. She told me that their mother had been talking to Garrett's parents, Garrett Rhodes, Cora's fiancé, the man she was marrying in spring, and that in the course of several conversations over the preceding months, Diane had described me in a way that had apparently settled into the Rhodes family's understanding of the Vasquez family picture. "She told them," Cora said carefully, "that you've had a hard go of it since David, that you're working on getting back on your feet, that things are starting to look up." I was quiet for a moment. Marco looked up from his eraser, read something in my face, and looked back down. "Starting to look up," I repeated. "I know, Cora. My company grossed more last year than David and I combined made in the last 2 years of our marriage. I know, Elena. Does Garrett know any of that?" A pause. "He knows what Mom's told him. She talks about you like you're still in the apartment, like you never moved." She never moved. There it was, precise as an invoice. In my mother's circulating version of Elena Vasquez, time had stopped at the crying phone call from the empty kitchen, and everything I'd built since then was apparently taking place in a parallel universe she hadn't received news from. The dinner was 9 days away. It was an engagement dinner, Cora and Garrett, his parents Susan and Paul Rhodes, and our mother, at a restaurant Diane had chosen herself. It was meant to be the family's meeting properly. An introduction, a presentation, a table where my mother could arrange the story she wanted the Rhodes family to take home with them. I asked Cora where the dinner was. She told me. I was quiet for a longer moment this time. "Ferrara's," I said. "Yes. Mom said it was the nicest place that wasn't trying too hard. Is that okay? I know it's a little expensive, It's fine, I said. Ferrara's is fine. I hung up and stood at my kitchen counter for a while, running a thumb along the edge of my clipboard. Marco finished his math problem and held it up without looking at me, a habit he has that I love without understanding. The confidence of a child who assumes the people who love him are watching. I looked at his work. It was right. I told him so and put the clipboard down. I want to be clear about what I felt in those days between Cora's call and the dinner, because it wasn't anger exactly. Or it wasn't only anger. There was a layer of grief underneath it. The kind that accumulates not from a single wound, but from the slow, patient understanding that someone you love has held a smaller version of you in place, and that their love, real as it may be, has always been addressed to someone shorter than you are. My mother had been handing out a photograph of me that was 6 years out of date and presenting it as current. She'd been doing it to people who were becoming my sister's family. And she'd been doing it, I suspected, with a certain amount of tenderness. The tenderness of someone who saw themselves as the custodian of the true and difficult facts about a person they cared for. She was not lying. She believed it. That was the part that was hardest to put down. I did not call her to correct it. I thought about it, and I decided not to, partly because a phone call would become an argument, and an argument would become about my mother's feelings, and my mother's feelings would somehow become evidence of my ingratitude, and I had played that particular game of telephone enough times to know where it ended. But partly, and I want to be honest about this, because I had already done the math on the dinner. Ferrara's, my account, my name on the private events brochure in the front entrance. The staff who had watched me run 12 dinners in that back room and would know my face the moment I walked through the door. Let me tell you how the Ferrara's account started, because it matters to understand what the restaurant meant before I ever walked in for that dinner. About 2 years earlier, I'd gotten a call from a woman named Patricia Chu, who was organizing a retirement dinner for her husband at what she described as her favorite restaurant in the city. The restaurant's kitchen was booked solid and couldn't take on an additional private event without compromising service in the main dining room. The restaurant's events coordinator had given Patricia my name. Then Patricia had called me, and then Nico Ferrara had called me directly. I'd heard of Ferrara's. I'd eaten there once, years before the divorce, for an anniversary that belonged to a version of my life I no longer spent time in. I knew its reputation, serious food, no shortcuts, the kind of place that survived 15 years because it refused to change anything that was working. When Nico called, the conversation lasted 4 minutes. He asked what I could do, what I couldn't, and what my margin looked like for a private dinner of 40. I gave him accurate answers. He said he'd call back. He called back in 2 hours. I talked to Patricia, he said. She said you were straightforward on the phone. I like straightforward. He gave me the booking. I ran the dinner. 40 guests, 3 courses, 45-minute service window. No issues. Nico came into the back room at the end of the evening and ate a plate of the dessert course, standing at the prep table, and said, without any performance of a compliment, "You're clean. I don't get clean from outside caterers." By clean, he meant organized, methodical, no waste, no drama, no shortcuts that showed up on the plate. I said, I appreciate that. He said, I'm doing a spring fundraiser in March. 70 people, outdoor setting. Are you interested? We've worked together ever since. I have keys to the Ferrara's dry storage. His sous chef texts me supply questions when they're in a pinch. My company's name is in the private events brochure in a brushed silver frame by the front door of the restaurant my mother chose for her impression-making dinner. The nicest place that wasn't trying too hard, without knowing her daughter had been feeding its private events for 2 years. I was not planning anything. I want to be clear about that. I am not the kind of woman who constructs scenes. I am the kind of woman who reads a situation accurately and decides in advance how she would like to carry herself when it unfolds. I decided I would carry myself calmly. I would go to the dinner. I would be gracious to the Rhodes family, warm to my sister, and respectful to my mother. I would not correct the record out loud. I would not offer a résumé. I would not perform a version of myself designed to land at the expense of anyone else at the table. And if the restaurant recognized me, if Nico came out, if any of the senior staff called me by name, if the private events brochure happened to be visible in the entrance where my mother would walk past it, then I would let the truth do what truth does when you stop trying to argue it into existence and simply allow it to be present. I picked out a dark navy dress the night before. Marco watched from the doorway. You look like you're going somewhere important, he said. Engagement dinner for Aunt Cora, I told him. He considered this. Is Grandma going to be weird? I looked at my son, 9 years old, with my eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. Already possessed of a social intelligence I had worked much harder to develop. Probably a little, I said. He nodded. You'll be okay. he said with the certainty of someone who has never had reason to doubt it, and went back to his room. I stood at my mirror for a moment holding that sentence. Then I hung the dress and went to make us both dinner, because he had homework and I had a morning delivery, and the evening was still hours away from being anything. If you've ever gotten ready for a family dinner knowing that the room already has a version of you in it that you didn't put there, drop the word dinner in the comments. I want to know how many of us have sat down at a table that was already set against us. And stay close, because the restaurant is coming, and what happened at the door hasn't even started yet. Ferrara's sits on the corner of Merchant and Fifth in a building that used to be a textile warehouse. Nico kept the bones, the brick, the high ceilings, the industrial windows, and turned the interior warm with candlelight and dark wood and the smell of a kitchen that has been cooking serious food for 15 years. The entrance has a small host stand, and to the left of it, mounted on the wall in a brushed silver frame, is a card listing Ferrara's private event services. At the bottom of that card, under the heading Catering Partner, are the words, Vasquez Private Events, my name, my company, in brushed silver. On the wall, my mother walked past it to get to the host stand. I saw this happen from approximately 4 feet behind her. I had arrived at the same moment as my mother and Cora and Garrett, pulling into the parking lot in the same wave of arrivals, which meant we walked in together, which meant I was behind my mother as she approached the entrance, and I watched her eyes move across the framed card the way eyes move across things they are not reading because they are looking for the host. She didn't see it, or she saw it and the name didn't register because there was no frame in her current story for Vasquez Private Events to be a thing worth registering. I said nothing. I smiled at the host, a young man named Devon who had worked my last 3 events at Ferrara's and who looked up, recognized me, and opened his mouth. I gave him the smallest, most imperceptible shake of my head. I want to be honest about this moment too, because some people would call it calculated. I prefer to call it patient. Devon closed his mouth, smiled professionally, and led us to the table where the Rhodes family was already seated. Paul and Susan Rhodes were in their early 60s, the kind of couple who had arrived at a comfortable ease with each other that made them relaxing to sit near. Paul was a civil engineer, recently retired. Susan had run a landscape architecture firm for 30 years. They were not people trying to impress anyone. They were people who had stopped needing to. My mother, sitting across from them, had not stopped needing to. She was in her element, a restaurant she'd chosen, a table she'd arranged, a dinner designed to present the Vasquez family at its best. She was warm and precise and told a story about Cora's childhood that made everyone laugh. She was good at this. I will always give her that. I sat next to Garrett's mother, Susan, which turned out to be the right seat. Susan had the quiet attentiveness of someone who spent decades listening to clients describe what they wanted their yards to feel like, and she brought that same quality to a dinner table. She asked me what I did. I told her I ran a catering company, private events primarily. That's wonderful, she said, and I could tell she meant it as a genuine observation and not a performance of politeness. What kind of events? I was explaining when my mother's voice came in from across the table, light and conversational, the voice she uses when she is redirecting without appearing to redirect. Elena is still building it up, she said. She had a rough patch for a while, but she's really working hard. It's a small operation, but you know, everything starts somewhere. Susan looked at me. I looked at my mother. Diane was already turning back to Paul to resume an earlier thread about Cora's wedding venue. She hadn't meant it as a blow. I want to keep saying that because it matters. She was filling in, offering context, being the helpfully informative mother who keeps the guests oriented. She believed every word of it. In her mind, she had said something true and supportive, and the slight emphasis on still building and small was not cruelty. It was an accurate reading of the photograph she'd been carrying. Susan said to me quietly, "How long have you been in business?" Six years, I said. She raised an eyebrow. The kind that means that's not a startup anymore. Do you work with restaurants at all, or exclusively private clients? Both, I said. I have a restaurant account that's been running for 2 years. Private events catering. They call me when they have a booked function that exceeds their kitchen's bandwidth. I did not say the restaurant's name. I had decided I would not be the one to say the name. I let the dinner continue. The food at Ferrara's was excellent, because it always is. We ordered in courses. The conversation moved the way dinner conversations move when everyone is making a collective effort. Surface warmth, occasional depth, the gentle mapping of 2 families across a white tablecloth. Garrett was good for my sister. I'd known that from the first time I met him. He had the quality of someone who had been given enough that he didn't need to take, and that ease had passed to his parents. I sat between Susan and Cora, which turned out to be the right placement. Susan and I had gotten going on a conversation about building something from scratch, She'd asked me to tell her more about the catering company, and I'd given her the real version, the commercial kitchen, the current accounts, the size of the events we handled. She listened with the focused attentiveness of someone who had done the same kind of building and recognized the vocabulary. At one point, she said, "How many staff do you have now?" "4 full-time," I said. "I bring in contract help for larger events. Last fall I had a private dinner for 90, and I ran a team of 11 for that one." "A dinner for 90, she repeated. She said it appraisingly, like someone pricing house at a fair valuation. Across the table, my mother was in conversation with Paul about something. I caught the words wedding venue and outdoor ceremony, and she was comfortable and warm and in her element, and I watched her for a moment and felt the familiar complicated feeling of loving a person while being clear-eyed about what they do, because I could see it happening in real time. Even here, even tonight, while I was having a genuine conversation about my company with the woman directly beside me, my mother was over there, holding her version steady, filling the room with it. I could hear it in the pauses when Paul asked about the Vasquez family and she described Cora first and longest, and then mentioned me with that particular gentleness that signals a managed topic. Elena is doing her best. She's working on it, working on it. 6 years and a commercial kitchen lease and a name in a silver frame on the wall, and she was telling his parents I was working on it. I turned back to Susan. Susan was watching me with a quiet intelligence, the way people watch when they have heard two different versions of something and are deciding which one fits the room better. I didn't ask her what she'd already been told. I didn't offer a correction. I just kept talking about the work, the way the work actually was, and let that be what it was. My mother was performing, but she was performing well, and for a long stretch of the main course I thought the evening might pass without incident. I had begun to recalibrate, to think that maybe I'd been preparing for a confrontation that wasn't coming, that the story my mother told about me to others was simply something I'd have to absorb the way I absorbed all the other small, persistent inaccuracies of being known by someone who stopped updating their notes years ago. I was on the last of my entree when the billing error happened. It was nothing dramatic. A server, a new one I didn't recognize, came by to let us know there had been a slight confusion on the table's drinks order, and they were just sorting it out at the register, and that the adjusted check would be a few minutes. It was the kind of small, ordinary restaurant moment that passes without comment at most tables. At our table, my mother laughed. It was a small laugh, the kind she produces when she has thought of something she can't resist saying. And what she said, leaning slightly forward with a smile that included the whole table in the joke, looking at me with the affectionate, public warmth of a mother who has no idea what she's about to do, was this: "Alana, you weren't planning on covering your own plate tonight, were you? Because I don't want there to be any stress," she said it gently. "The way you say something to a child before a field trip when you want to make sure they've packed a lunch. The way you pre-solve a problem to protect someone from embarrassment, not realizing that the protection is the embarrassment. That the offering of it out loud, in front of Susan and Paul Rhodes and my sister and her fiancé, with a small fond laugh. I know it's tight, sweetheart, no shame in that. Lands not as shelter but as a verdict, delivered publicly, confirmed by the laugh. The table shifted almost imperceptibly. Susan looked at her plate. Paul took a sip of water. Garrett glanced at Cora. Cora looked at the middle distance the way she does when she wants to be anywhere else in the world. And I felt the thing move through me that always moves through me in these moments. Not the hot rush of anger, but something colder and more exact. The precise sensation of being correctly read and incorrectly labeled simultaneously. My mother knew me well enough to know exactly where to press. She just didn't know she was pressing a woman who had changed her address. I set my fork down on the edge of my plate. I smoothed my napkin once, unhurried, the gesture of a person who is in no particular rush. I smiled at my mother across the table. Not a performed smile, a real one, because she had no idea, and the gap between what she thought she knew and what was about to become apparent in this room was already, quietly, closing. And I said, very pleasantly, "I think we'll be fine, Mom." She patted the air in that little gesture that means of course, satisfied. The table breathed again, awkwardly, and Garrett asked Paul something about the civil engineering project he'd retired from, and the conversation moved. I lifted my water glass. I want to be accurate about the 30 seconds that followed, because they mattered. For 30 seconds, the table was rebuilding its surface. Everyone reaching for a topic, reclaiming the warmth of the evening, covering over the small odd moment the way people cover over things that don't have a name. And Susan beside me turned quietly back toward me and said in a low voice meant only for the two of us, "Your work sounds remarkable, Elena. Really, 2 words, really. The word you add when you want someone to know you mean it without a ceremony." I thanked her. I meant it. And not 3 minutes later, from the direction of the kitchen, I heard a voice I recognized. Nico Ferrara does not come out to work the dining room. He is a kitchen man. He appears on the floor at Ferrara's perhaps twice in an evening, briefly, to touch a table where he knows someone or to solve a problem that requires his face. He is not a restaurateur who performs. He is a craftsman who occasionally surfaces. He surfaced now because Deven, the host who had recognized me at the door and held his greeting, had apparently made his way back to the kitchen at some point in the evening and let Nico know that his private events caterer was sitting in the dining room. I heard his voice before I saw him. Vasquez. It was not loud. It carried the way a voice carries when it is used to being the one that settles a room, and the table where I sat, along with the two tables nearest to it, turned toward the sound. Nico was crossing the dining room in his kitchen whites, his hands clean because he had clearly paused to wash them before coming out, which is the Nico equivalent of dressing for an occasion. He was looking at me with the expression he uses when he is both genuinely pleased and slightly exasperated, because genuine pleasure and slight exasperation are his primary settings. "You're eating in my dining room without telling me," he said, arriving at the table and addressing this statement to me as though the other 7 people were ambient. "Devon told me 15 minutes ago. I would have had the kitchen send something." I said, "I didn't want to fuss, Nico." "You never want to fuss," he said, and there was a quality in the way he said it. Warm, a little pointed, the tone of a man summarizing a characteristic he has catalogued over years, that landed on the table the way a credential lands. He turned to the rest of the table with the brisk courtesy of a man who has spent his career welcoming people to rooms he is responsible for. I made the introductions: my mother, my sister, Garrett, and his parents. He shook hands with Susan and Paul with the efficiency of someone who has met 1,000 people and can calibrate attention correctly. Then he looked back at me. "How was the duck?" he asked. "Be honest, the brine is better than last quarter," I said. He pointed a finger at me. "I told Marcos the same thing." He glanced at Paul Rhodes. "She did a private dinner for 30 in our back room in February, 45-minute service window, complete menu, 0 issues. I don't say that about many people." He looked back at me. "You should have told Devon when you booked. I'd have taken care of the table," I said. "I didn't want special treatment." "You never do," he said again, with the same quality in it. Then to the table. "You're in good hands for the check. Devon, fix whatever the mix-up was and put the drinks on the house." He looked at me one more time in the efficient, appraising way of a man whose time is his primary currency. "Vasquez, come by the kitchen before you leave. I want to show you the spring menu. I have thoughts about April." He walked back to the kitchen. The table sat in the kind of quiet that a room settles into when something has shifted, and everyone is deciding how to carry it. I want to tell you what I saw on my mother's face in the moment after Nico walked away, because it's important and I've thought about it many times since. It wasn't humiliation exactly. Not at first. What I saw first was confusion. The specific confusion of a person whose map has just been contradicted by the territory. She was looking at me the way you look at a room you thought you knew when you discover a door you didn't know was there. And then the confusion resolved into something more complicated, something that lived between recognition and loss. The expression of a woman who had been confidently describing a place she hadn't visited in years, and had just been handed a current photograph. She looked at Susan Rhodes. Susan was looking at me with a warm, genuine interest that had nothing apologetic in it. Paul had leaned forward slightly. They were recalibrating in real time, and the recalibration was plainly, visibly in my direction. Cora was looking at the tablecloth. Garrett put his hand over Cora's, which was the right thing to do. My mother opened her mouth once and closed it again, a thing I have almost never seen her do. Diane Vasquez does not run out of language. Language is her instrument, and for approximately 8 seconds at that dinner table, the instrument was silent. I did not say anything. I did not look at her with triumph or tenderness or anything else I'd been carrying up to that moment. I picked up my water glass, took a quiet sip, and turned to Susan Rhodes and asked about the landscape firm she'd built. How she'd started it, what the early years had looked like. Susan told me. She was good at telling it, the way people who built something real are always good at telling it, without drama, with the particular pride of an earned thing. My mother listened, and while she listened, I could feel her performing a private recalculation I had no part in, revising a photograph she'd been passing around for 6 years, adding the building I'd put up in the years she hadn't been watching. Devon brought the adjusted check. I took it. My mother reached forward. "Elena, I can. I've got it," I said, pleasantly, completely without performance. The way I say it to my employees when they offer to stay late and I have already decided otherwise. I covered the table, the whole table, without announcement, without a pause for reaction. I tucked the folder shut and handed it back to Devon and did not make a moment out of it because a moment was the last thing I wanted. Some things are said most clearly in the language of ordinary action. The dinner wound down in the way dinners do when the substantive part is finished and everyone is finding their coats. Susan hugged me before she left and said she hoped we'd see more of each other. She said it to me specifically. Paul shook my hand and said something about wanting to find a private caterer for a firm reunion dinner he was organizing, and could I send him information, and I told him to have Garrett pass along my contact. Cora hugged me at the door, a longer hug than usual, the kind that was also a sentence, and then it was just my mother and me at the edge of the parking lot, in the kind of cool that comes down after a warm evening, the restaurant still glowing behind us. She had her keys in her hand. She was looking at me with an expression I didn't have a name for because it was one I hadn't seen from her before. "Elena," she said. I waited. "The catering," she said. "Is it? Are things really going well?" It was not the apology a screenwriter would have written for this moment. It was small and sideways and came dressed as a clarifying question when it was actually something closer to a reopened door. And it would have been very easy, standing in that parking lot with the weight of 6 years of outdated photographs behind me, to push the door all the way open and let the full inventory of what she'd missed walk through it. "I didn't do that," I said. "Yes, Mom, things are really going well." She nodded, processing. "Then, I didn't know about the restaurant." "I know," I said. "You could have told me." And here is where I had to be careful, because this sentence, "you could have told me," is the pivot on which a certain kind of argument turns. The argument that reframes the problem as my silence rather than her certainty. That says the gap is my failure to fill it rather than her decision to stop leaving room. I thought about it for a moment, and I answered honestly. "I probably could have," I said. "And maybe I should have. But Mom, I've been telling you in different ways for years that things were better than you were describing, and I think somewhere I stopped believing the information would update the story." She was quiet for a moment. "I was trying to protect you," she said, "from people judging you before they knew you." "I know you were," I said. And then, because it was true, and because it mattered more to say than anything else I was holding, "The problem is that when you protect someone from judgment by prejudging them yourself, you don't actually protect them. You just get there first." She looked at me for a long moment. She didn't have an answer for that, and I didn't need her to, not right then. I wasn't trying to win a conversation. I was trying to tell the truth one time, clearly, and then let her sit with it without managing what she did next. I want to be fair to her here, because fairness is the only thing I ever ask of myself when I talk about my mother. She is not a villain in this story. I want to be clear about that the way I want to be clear about everything, with precision and without decoration. She is a woman who loves her children with a fierce and genuine love that expresses itself, imperfectly and sometimes painfully, through the management of appearances. She was shaped by people who were shaped by harder circumstances than ours. People for whom a good presentation was not vanity but protection, and she never fully unlearned the lesson that the story you tell about yourself to the world is the thing standing between you and disaster. I understand that. Understanding it doesn't make it cost less. What she had never quite understood about me is that the story I was telling about myself, the one you build with work and time and a commercial kitchen lease and a name in a silver frame, was not competing with hers. I wasn't trying to outperform her version or disprove it in front of witnesses. I was just living a life that had moved past it, and the moving past was not personal. It was just the natural direction of a life when you get out of its way and let it go where it's going. She hadn't gotten out of the way, but she was standing in that parking lot looking at me with the expression of someone who had just been handed a current map and was beginning to understand how far from the territory her old one had drifted. That was enough. For that night, it was enough. I hugged her. Briefly, genuinely. "Drive safe," I said, and walked to my car. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before I started the engine. The restaurant lights reflected in the windshield, and I could see Nico's kitchen window, still lit, and I thought about the April menu he'd wanted to walk me through, and made a note to come by Thursday. Then I thought about Marco at home with his homework and the babysitter, and the way he'd said, "You'll be okay," with the certainty of a person who has never had reason to doubt it. I started the car. If you've ever had someone describe you to a room before you got there, using a version that stopped being true years ago, and felt the particular weight of walking in behind that description, comment the door in the section below. Because that walk, the one where you arrive into a story someone else has already been telling, is one of the loneliest ones I know, and I want to know how many of us have taken it. Subscribe if you haven't, because there's more of this story to carry. Here is what happened in the weeks that followed, and I want to tell it without embellishment because the truth of it is better than any decoration I could put on it. Cora called the next morning, not to debrief the evening. Cora is not a debriefer. She called to apologize, which I did not expect. Not because she isn't capable of apology, but because apologies require acknowledging that you had the option to do something different and chose not to. And that is a harder reckoning than most people are willing to have about their own passive silences. She apologized for not correcting Mom. Not once in the months the stories had been circulating. Not in the conversation when she'd passed the narrative along to me secondhand. Not at the dinner table in real time. She said she'd told herself it wasn't her business to manage the version of me that their mother was handing out. And that she'd understood in the parking lot that the thing she'd called not her business had been costing me every time Diane opened her mouth in front of someone new. It was easier to let it go, Cora said, because the correcting would have been a fight, and the fight would have been about Mom's feelings. And I'm tired of every fight in our family being about Mom's feelings, I said. I know, me too. We talked for a while. Really talked, the kind of talking that requires two people to stop managing each other and just be in the same room honestly. She told me things about what it had been like to be the favored one, which was not, it turned out, the uncomplicated position I had occasionally imagined it to be. The favored one also gets held to a photograph, just a more flattering one, and flattery has its own kind of cage. I told her I loved her. I meant it. She said she was going to talk to Garrett's mother and correct the record personally, and I told her she didn't have to. She said she wanted to. I told her that was her choice to make. It was a good phone call. It was the first phone call we'd had in years that wasn't surface maintenance, and it left me with the particular warmth that comes from discovering that a relationship you'd quietly given up on improving still had real depth in it. Waiting. Cora is going to be good at being married. Not because Garrett is easy, no one is easy, but because she has the quality, once she decides to use it, of being honest even when honesty is inconvenient. She just needed to stop letting the inconvenience be an excuse. Susan Rhodes, as it turned out, needed no correcting. She had done what observant people do with contradictory information. She had filed my mother's description and Nico's description and the dinner conversation alongside each other and arrived at her own conclusions. She sent a message through Garrett the following week asking for my company's card. She had a garden party in June, 60 people, outdoor setting. Could I do a past appetizer reception with a station dinner? I could. I quoted her honestly and she accepted immediately and said, "You know Garrett's mother is going to brag about finding you before I do." She paused, then added, "She already is." I booked the event. Then I sat in my kitchen and laughed for a little while. Not at my mother, at the particular efficiency of truth when you stop arguing it into rooms and simply let it show up. My mother called 2 weeks after the dinner. It was a Thursday evening. Marco was at a friend's house. I was doing quarterly billing at the kitchen table when the phone lit up with her name, and I answered it the way I answer any call that could go several directions. Present, calm, without an agenda. She asked how business was going, not how I was doing, not an opener about the weather or Cora's wedding planning. Just, how is business? I recognized the question for what it was. A door opened a crack, an acknowledgement indirect and incomplete that the business was a real thing worth asking about, that the category had been upgraded in her internal filing. My mother does not ask follow-up questions about things she has already decided are settled. When she asks, it means she has reopened the case. I told her about the June event, about the spring contract renewals, about Nico's April menu plans, which I'd gone over on Thursday, sitting at the pass in his kitchen while he explained what he was trying to do with the spring produce, and I told him what I could execute at volume and at what margin. She listened. I could hear her listening, which is different from hearing someone be quiet. There's a quality of actual reception in it, an intake. She didn't interrupt, which for Diane is also notable. She let me talk the way she lets a story talk when she is genuinely trying to understand it rather than redirect it. I didn't know it had gotten to that size, she said. It's been at that size for a while, I said, a pause. I think, she said, and then stopped. Tried again. I think I've been slow to update. It was not a full apology. I want to be accurate about that. It didn't name what she'd done or offer full acknowledgement of what it had cost. But it was the closest thing she knew how to offer in that direction. And I had long ago stopped expecting people to apologize in the language I would choose and started learning to read the languages they actually had. What I heard in Slow to Update was not the apology a screenwriter would write. What I heard was a woman who had been presented with evidence that contradicted her working theory and was doing the thing that is genuinely hard for people who have held a story long enough to believe it. She was revising, slowly, partially. in the sideways language of someone who doesn't yet have the full vocabulary for a direct admission. But revising, I said, "Yeah, I think so too." And then I said the thing I had decided, during the 2 weeks between the dinner and this phone call, that I would say if she ever gave me a door. I should have told you more, not because I needed your approval, but because you're my mother and you deserve to know who your daughter is now. That's on both of us. Silence then. I want to hear more about it, the business. When there's time. When there's time, I said. And then we talked about Cora's wedding dress for 20 minutes, which was a normal conversation about a normal thing. And when we hung up, the gap between us was not closed. It is not closed now. And may never close the way it would in a cleaner story. But it had shifted, something had been admitted quietly, in the sideways language of people who don't do direct well but are still, underneath the habit, trying. I'll take it. I've learned to take the real thing as it comes rather than hold out for the version I originally wanted. I know some people, hearing this story, will want more from that phone call. They'll want the moment where Diane Vasquez finally says, "Clearly and completely, I was wrong about you, Elena. I am sorry for the years of the wrong photograph." I understand that want. I felt it myself on and off for the better part of a decade. But here is what I know about apologies from the people who are hardwired against them. Sometimes the closest they get is a question, a turned toward question asked in good faith about something they previously refused to acknowledge as real. And if you can hear that question for what it is, not the apology you deserved but the beginning of one, you have a choice about whether to step through the door it opens or to stand outside it waiting for a more formal invitation. I walked through the door. I did it, because I am tired of standing outside rooms waiting to be formally welcomed into my own life. A few days later, Marco came home from school and we ate takeout at the kitchen table the way we do on Fridays. The good Thai place on Clement Street. The same 4 dishes we always get, because we are both creatures of reliable preference in the best possible way. His homework was spread across his half of the table. My laptop was open on mine, going over an event timeline for a corporate dinner in early May. At some point, while we were eating, he said, without looking up from something he was reading, "Did the dinner go okay? The one for Aunt Cora?" I looked at him. He was 7 bites into his noodles and apparently capable of tracking questions he'd held for 2 weeks without announcing it. "It went exactly right," I said. He looked up. "Grandma still weird?" "A little, but working on it." He considered this with the deep fairness of a child who has been taught that people are capable of doing better than their current performance. "That's okay," he said. "People take time." I said they do. He went back to his reading. I went back to my timeline. Outside the window, the evening was coming down in the way I love best. Slow and amber, the kind of light that makes even an ordinary kitchen look like somewhere you chose on purpose. Marco's drawings were pinned to the corkboard by the door, the ones he'd been making lately. Houses mostly, with everyone in them. No one outside, every window yellow. I have never told him to draw them that way. He just does. I think he draws the world the way it is at our table on a Friday, the two of us with our takeout and our work. Easy in the same room, no one waiting outside. He draws it the way we live it, and I realized, looking at those drawings in that light, that this, not the contract with Ferrara's, not the restored check at the dinner table, not Susan Rhodes booking the June event, was the thing I'd actually been building for 6 years, one careful Friday at a time, a table where no one gets counted out, a room where my son learns by experience every week that the people who love him don't make him wait outside. That is the inheritance I was after. Not the recognition from Nico, though I was grateful for it. Not my mother's slow revision, though I needed it more than I wanted to admit. Not any of the things that happened in that restaurant, which were real and mattered and will stay with me. The inheritance was the table. The inheritance was the boy at it, noodles on his chin, reading something complicated with his jaw set, who had looked at me 2 weeks earlier before an uncertain evening and said, without a single doubt in his voice, "You'll be okay. He's right. I am. I want to tell you one more thing before I close. Because it happened about a month after the dinner, and it belongs to this story the way the last line belongs to a good recipe. It's not the most dramatic ingredient, but it's the one that tells you the thing is finished. Cora's wedding is in the spring. Garrett's parents are hosting a pre-wedding celebration at their home. A garden party, the outdoor kind, 60 people, past appetizers and a station dinner. When Susan Rhodes called to book the event, she asked for me specifically. She had gotten my card from Devon at Ferrara's, where she had apparently gone back to eat 2 weeks after the engagement dinner. She told me Devon spoke very highly of working with my team. I booked the event, quoted her honestly, and confirmed the details with the same professionalism I bring to any client I want to keep for years. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a moment with my hands around my coffee mug and did the quiet arithmetic of it. Susan Rhodes had been introduced to a version of me that my mother had been carefully maintaining for years, the version that was behind, struggling, still getting back on her feet. She had heard that version delivered at a dinner table by someone who meant it as protection, and then she had sat beside me for 2 hours and made her own assessment and booked the caterer she'd actually met rather than the one she'd been told about. That is how the truth works when you stop arguing it and simply keep showing up. I did not tell my mother about the Rhodes booking. Not because I was withholding it as a point, but because some things are simply yours. The work is mine. The company is mine. The relationship I have with Susan Rhodes, built at a dinner table over a conversation about what it takes to build something real, that is mine. My mother will see the event in the spring. She'll see the team, the setup, the way the evening runs. She'll see her daughter working, not struggling, not trying, not still building, but working at full capacity, in command of something she built. I imagine she'll be proud of me then, and I think I'm ready to receive that pride without the years of grief mixed into it. I think I've done enough of the work, finally, to take the love without needing it to apologize for how long it took to show up clearly. That's the other thing nobody tells you about the people who held outdated versions of you. When they finally update, and the ones who love you will, eventually, the way a slow clock still moves, you have to be ready to accept the new version of their love without punishing it for the delay. Holding a grudge about someone finally seeing you clearly is its own kind of prison, and I've served enough time in rooms that didn't fit. I'm done building rooms I have to shrink to enter. Here's the thing I've carried away from that whole season, and I want to say it plainly because it took me a long time to find the plain version. You cannot update someone else's story about you from inside their story. You can try, with phone calls, with corrections, with careful rebuttals across restaurant tables. But a story someone tells about you, told long enough, with enough authority, becomes its own kind of fact to the people who hear it. You can't unsay it from inside it. What you can do is build something real, and keep building it, and trust that the real thing will eventually share a room with the story, and that in that room the story will have to explain itself. That's what happened at Ferrara's. I didn't argue my mother's version of me. I didn't bring receipts or rehearse a rebuttal or arrange a confrontation. I walked into the room I had helped build, and the room did the talking. And somewhere in the weeks after that dinner, my mother began the slow work of updating a photograph she had been carrying too long. Not because I demanded it, because the truth had been patient enough to be present until she was ready to look at it. I did not burn anything down. I didn't need to. A door only has power over you while you're standing outside it waiting to be let in. The day you find out you already work there, that your name is on the wall, is the day the door stops being a door and becomes just an entrance. I walk through it. I made my daughter, not a daughter, I made my son, who is the best argument I have ever made. Coco that evening with the little marshmallows, because he was 9 and the marshmallows mattered, and I read to him until he fell asleep. And I sat in the kitchen afterward in the quiet of a house where no one was waiting on a cold step. That's my story. One dinner, one wall with a name on it, and a boy who draws everyone inside. If this reached you today, share it with someone who's been told they're still in the falling when they're already up. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.